In previous videos, we've looked at a range of different renewable energy sources, but in this tutorial, we're going to discuss the rates of adoption of each of these renewable energy sources, particularly in the UK. Now, before getting on to that, we're going to look at a couple of things. First of all, we're going to look at the drivers behind the uptake of renewables and why there's such pressure to produce energy from renewable energy sources. We're then going to look at some targets relating to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to look at how the UK government manages those reductions. Then we're going to move on to look at the UK's historic energy consumption and whether we're using more or less energy than we used to. We'll then look at the UK's progress against their renewable targets before finishing by looking at the predicted growth of different renewable energy technologies. So as a starting point, it's important to understand why there's pressure on countries to uptake renewable energy. And it should come as no surprise that some of our non-renewable energy sources are running out. But in addition to that, the burning of coals and fossil fuels actually damages the environment. It produces carbon dioxide and various other different pollutants. So the first thing to acknowledge is this is a problem that affects countries all around the world. And it's something that's up for discussion at United Nations conferences. Now, the United Nations is a global organisation that was set up to tackle problems that affect people all around the world. Things such as famine and climate change, things that everyone has a part to play in. Now, one of the United Nations conferences is the Earth Summits, and in particular we're going to discuss the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. Now, at the Earth Summits, the topics that are up for discussion are things such as sustainability, environmental issues and climate change. And at this particular conference in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was opened for signature. So if you can imagine, there's heads of state from all around the world at this conference, and they're being asked to sign this particular convention, which commits their countries to reducing carbon dioxide emissions and uptaking renewable energy. So there's quite a lot of pressure on the member states of the United Nations. And to put this into context, at the time there would have been more than 100 heads of states present at the conference. Now, following on from the UNFCCC, we had the Kyoto Protocol of 2005. And this was an extension of the UNFCCC, but what it aimed to put in place was legally binding agreements between the party members. And at the time of signing, there was around 190 parties who were involved in the signing of the Kyoto Protocol. So once again, this tackled the issue of reducing carbon dioxide emissions and uptaking renewable energy, but this accepted that the 190 parties had common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, just to explain that, common responsibilities means it's the responsibility of every party to try to reduce the damaging effects on the environment. Differentiated means that some countries are in a better position to impact on climate change than others. So, for example, some countries might be producing more CO2, and underdeveloped countries may struggle to improve their infrastructure. So we can see here that this is a global issue, and there's pressure on every country to do their part in order to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So how did this affect the United Kingdom directly? Well, in the Kyoto Protocol, each country had specific targets. And the UK at the time was grouped into the EU15, which was termed as a bubble of countries. So the European countries were grouped in a bubble, the EU15, and they were set a target between 2008 and 2012 of an 8% reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. And this was benchmarked against the emissions in 1990. The UK's target was somewhat higher at 12.5%, and again this is because of this differentiated approach. So between 2008 and 2012, the UK's individual target was 12.5%. Now, the UK and the EU as a whole met those targets, and new targets were set in 2013. So the EU target in Kyoto 2, or the second round, between 2013 to 2020 is 20% of the 1990 benchmark. Bearing in mind we've already achieved the 8% against that benchmark. And the UK target between 2013 and 2020 is also 20%. All of the countries this time have been given equal responsibility. Now you'll notice that the number of countries involved has now increased to 31. So we can see that a lot more countries are becoming actively involved in reducing their carbon dioxide emissions. So we've been speaking about reducing carbon dioxide emissions, but what we haven't really spoken about is the uptake of renewable energy. Now, because energy production plays such an important role in producing carbon dioxide, the EU wrote something called the Renewable Energy Directive. And in that Renewable Energy Directive, the UK target for the uptake of renewable energy is to cover 15% of all of the energy used. And we'll look at how that's broken down in a moment. So by the year 2020, the UK is expected to produce 15% of all of the energy it consumes from renewable energy sources. So the important question now becomes, how does the UK manage these reductions of greenhouse gas emissions and the uptake of renewable energy? Well, first of all, a law needs to be passed, and the UK Climate Change Act of 2008 was passed. And built into that was something called the Climate Change Levy. Now, the Climate Change Levy is essentially a tax on companies for producing carbon dioxide, and it's linked to the amount of energy that they consume. So now the UK government is taxing companies based on the amount of energy they use, which is an incentive for them to reduce their energy consumption. Now, alongside that, the UK government introduced the UK Renewables obligation, and the Renewables obligation gave energy companies tax breaks, providing they generated a certain percentage of their energy from renewables. So it's worth mentioning that the climate change levy also impacted on energy companies. So if you're an energy company and you manage a power plant, then power plants produce a huge amount of carbon dioxide. On the flip side, if you're an energy company and you commit to producing more of your energy from renewable sources, then you're entitled to tax breaks and various other incentives. Now, I mentioned previously that the UK Renewables target was to produce 15% of all of its energy from renewable sources by the year 2020, but we need to break that down a little bit further. The expectation by 2020 is that 30% of all of our electricity comes from renewable sources, 12% of all of our heating, and 10% of all of our transport. So the renewable target doesn't only affect the production of electricity, although that accounts for the largest percentage. And not only that, it's the area that we're specifically interested in this unit. So by the year 2020, the UK needs to be producing 30% of its electricity from renewable energy sources. So in a moment, we'll look at how we're progressing against that target. But first of all, it's important to understand historically how much energy the UK consumes, particularly for electricity. So we're going to look at a number of different charts, and all of these charts are from UK government press notices and publications, so they're available in the public domain. If you're logged into the study platform, I'm actually going to provide links to each of these publications underneath this video, just in case you want to do some additional background reading. So here we have a chart of the UK's energy consumption by sector, and the date range here is 1970 on the left-hand side to 2017 on the right-hand side. Now there's various different sectors here consuming energy, and it's important to point out that this isn't just electricity, it's also heating and various other different types of energy. So if we start at the bottom, we can see that the service industry and their energy consumption has remained fairly consistent. And we can also see that the use of domestic energy, which means households, rose to a peak in around 2005, and it's actually slowly decreasing. Now this may come as a surprise because you would think that we use more energy now than we used to. We have a lot more electrical devices and so on. But in truth, the efficiency of all of these devices is much improved. Take lighting as a prime example. Most light bulbs nowadays have an energy rating between 3 and 5 watts, whereas they used to be 60 watts. That's 20 times more energy being consumed by an old light bulb than the light bulbs that we use today. And that will apply to various other devices that existed in 1970, such as washing machines and televisions and so on. Now the biggest changes that we know is in industry. And by industry we mean heavy industry and manufacturing, and we see a huge decline between 1970 and the present day. And the area where we see the biggest increase is in transport. Again, that should come as no surprise. There's a lot more vehicles on the road, and we have a huge number of flights going out on a daily basis. So next, we have energy consumption by fuel types. And again, this is important because what we notice, and the area we're most interested in, is electricity. So electricity is the second line from the bottom, and we see that we have a peak around 2000, it drops off slightly, and it's slowly increasing again. So electricity consumption has changed, but it seems to be levelling off somewhat, for the reasons that we spoke about on the previous slide. Now, the huge areas of change we see here are the consumption of gas, which is used for heating and cooking. We see a huge reduction in the burning of solid fuels, and we see various other trends for the use of petroleum and the use of bioenergy. But the one we're primarily interested in is the electricity, which appears to be levelling off. And we'll look at forecasts for electricity in a moment. So now let's consider our progress against those renewable targets. How are we actually performing? Now, once again, the data that we're going to look at is from UK government press releases. And once again, I'll provide links under the video if you're logged into the study platform. Now, most importantly, what we need to look at is how we're performing against that target of 30% of energy from renewable energy sources. And what we notice here, there's various different trend lines on here, but the one that we're concerned with is the one that links to the Renewable Energy Directive, and that's as a percentage of gross electricity consumption. So if we identify that line here, we can see that in 2017, we're sitting somewhere between 25 and 30% of all of our electrical energy being produced from renewable sources. So we're very close to that target of 30%. Of that renewable energy, it's also useful to understand where that energy is coming from, so what sources of renewable energy. And here we can see various different trends, starting from the year 2000 to 2017. We notice that landfill and hydro sit at relatively the same levels. We've seen a huge increase in the uptake of solar. We've also seen a relatively significant increase in the rate of uptake of onshore wind and offshore wind. So this really highlights the areas where the biggest improvements are being made are in solar energy and wind farms or wind turbines. I also have some data for 2018. Now just note that this is only for quarter one, so the first quarter of the year, and we've got a comparison for 2017 against the same quarter in 2018. And the section we're interested in is the section here for renewables, where we see in 2018 we've reached our target of 30%, or here we see 30.1%, compared with 2017, where it was 27%. But that was specifically for quarter one. It is important to note that consumption of energy from quarter to quarter varies. So here we see the various different consumption of different energy sources for each quarter between 2015 and 2018. In actual fact, quarter one is the quarter where we tend to consume the most energy. So it's useful to compare how much of that energy comes from renewables for quarter one. Okay, let's finish by looking at the predicted growth of renewables and what opportunities this presents. As before, the data comes from UK government press releases. And we're going to look at two things in particular. First of all, we're going to look at our expected changes in energy consumption, because we've already said that we've reached our 30% target, so there will only be pressure to increase the amount of energy we produce from renewables if our consumption is expected to increase. And then we'll look at our expected growth of renewables. So we're going to look at a number of different charts, but the most important one is this first one on the left-hand side, because this represents our total energy demand broken down by fuel type. And we have different fuel types here. And the top line represents the overall, so the sum of this line and this line here. And these two lines, the top one represents gas, oil and solid fuels, which is obviously what we're trying to move away from. And the bottom line represents electricity and renewables. So this is the important line. We want to know how our consumption of electricity and renewables is going to increase. Now we're currently sitting here at 2018, and what we can see is although we have a steady increase in the amount of electricity the country uses, it is relatively steady. There's no sharp spikes here. So we will need to continue expanding our renewables provision at a steady rate. Now there's various other different charts that break this down by sector. So here we have transport, and again we can see an increase in the amount of electricity required for transport. That shouldn't really come as a surprise because we know that they're trying to introduce electric vehicles and phase out petrol-driven vehicles. And that's why we also see the trend that the amount of petrol consumed is likely to reduce. So the move to electric vehicles is likely to impact on this overall increase in the amount of electricity that we require. We'll just take a look at a couple more sectors. Here we have the demand by industry, and as we said, heavy industry tends to be declining. Therefore, the use of gas, oil and solid fuels is declining, and the use of electricity is remaining relatively flat, but with a very slight decline. The domestic sector, on the other hand, so households, we're seeing an increase in the consumption of electricity because we have more electrical devices, and we're seeing a very steady increase in the consumption of gas, oil and solid fuels. And this would account for things such as cooking and central heating. The final chart is for our service sector, and it says they're including agriculture. Now, as heavy industry has declined, we've seen an increase in the service industries or the service sector. So it should come as no surprise that we see an increase in the amount of electricity and renewables used by that sector as the sector's growing. But we also see a decrease in the gas and oil consumption again. That will be partly because of things such as the climate change levy, where there's pressure on companies to use less energy. So the net result of all of this is that we are going to need to produce more energy, particularly from renewable energy sources. However, that increase is relatively small as a percentage. So finally, we have our predictions of where that energy should come from. Now, the energy production here will map directly on to the expected energy consumption. However, if you cross-compare, just note that the units are different here. So here we have terawatt hours, and on the previous slide the units was megatons of oil equivalent, so a comparison against tons of oil. However, some of the trends that we've already mentioned can be seen here. We see a relatively steady increase in the use of renewables between 2017 and 2033, going up from around 100 to around 190 terawatt hours. So that's quite a significant anticipated increase. Now, the reason for that is because what we're looking to do is reduce a couple of other things. We're certainly looking to reduce our consumption of gas. We know that natural gas is running out. We need to reduce our consumption. But over time, another one that we want to reduce is our net imports. We see a relatively big increase in net imports before we see any type of reduction. Now, just to explain net imports is imported electricity from mainland Europe. So we actually import a significant percentage of the electricity that we use from France and the continent. And that's obviously not ideal in terms of securing the UK supply of electricity. We also see in the coming years a decline in the use of coal to the point where we will no longer be reliant on coal. And the final line is for nuclear energy. Alongside the increase of renewables, we see an anticipated increase in the use of nuclear power. Now finally, let's look at a breakdown as to where that renewable energy is expected to come from. Now once again, this will map onto the previous diagram, but the units are different. Here we have gigawatt hours, and on the previous slide we had terawatt hours. So there's a factor of 1,000 difference there. The other difference between this graph and the previous graph is this one only goes up to the year 2020. These are short-term projections in line with our targets for the production of renewable energy. But nonetheless, let's take a look at where the anticipated growth areas are. So first of all, the band at the bottom, we see anticipated increases in the amount of onshore wind, and above that we see anticipated increases in the amount of offshore wind. The anticipated increase in the use of solar and hydropower is negligible. So these aren't expected to be significant growth areas. However, moving up nearer the top, we do see some increase in the use of biomass. And we do see some increase in the use of energy from waste, which is essentially the burning of waste to produce electricity. But it seems that most of the emphasis is going to be on wind power. Now, without going into too much detail, the reasons behind this is because the UK has a very good wind resource, meaning that it's very windy. And in addition to that, we're an island, so being surrounded by the sea means that we can expand our offshore capacity. Okay, so to summarise, we've looked at the drivers behind the uptake of renewables, and we've also looked at the UK targets for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Just note that the two are linked. Increasing the use of renewables has an impact on the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that we produce. We've also looked at how the UK government manages those reductions by introducing laws, taxes and incentives in order to drive change. We've looked at the UK's historic energy consumption, and we've looked at how we're progressing against our renewables targets. Then finally, we looked at our predicted growth in the use of energy, as well as our predicted growth of renewables, and we've briefly discussed some of the opportunities that might present.